Good evening and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon. I'm the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. Last week, Amy spoke beautifully about Constable's White Horse. And whenever people think of British early 19th century painting, romantic painters of the time, they always think of Constable in opposition to, in comparison with, Joseph Mallard William Turner. And this comparison between Turner and Constable is one that is very often discussed and thought about. So today I decided to pair Amy's talk with one on Turner. We have 5 Turners at the Frick Collection, which were acquired by Henry Clay Frick. The 2 most beautiful, grandest ones are in the West Gallery, and people are used to seeing the 2 views of Dieppe on the left and Cologne on the right at the center of the long walls of the West Gallery. People will be surprised to find out that, in fact, when Frick bought them in 1914, over a period of a few months, one from the other, he did not have them displayed in the West Gallery. And actually, he never saw them there. In his days, they hung it separately, Cologne in the South Hall and Dieppe in the North Hall, in much smaller passages and spaces. But of course, since then, since 1942, the 2 paintings were moved to the West Gallery, and they've been there ever since. And of course, they're one of the great glories of the collection. Today, I'm going to talk about Turner's view of Dieppe. And when I think of Dieppe, I associate the place with travel. And this is not only because this painting is so filled, packed with sort of boats and people coming and going. Some of my earliest memories go to Dieppe and are related to travel, and they have nothing to do with Turner's painting. When I was a child in the 1980s, every summer we would travel from Rome, where I grew up and where I lived, to England to visit my grandmother and my cousins. And we would do that by car with my parents and my 2 sisters and later my brother. And here's a photo of me as a kid in Dieppe in the early mid-1980s. And the reason we would stop in Dieppe was that after several stops in Switzerland and France by car, we would take a ferry in Dieppe and cross the channel to New Haven. And for me, since the earliest days of my life, Dieppe is associated with this idea of crossing the channel and getting into England. Of course, Dieppe today is not much different. They still have ferries connecting Dieppe with New Haven and with England. But of course, when we think of travel today, we think of flying, we think of much faster ways of traveling. And today, the theme of this cocktails is going to be very much about different ways of traveling and periods when travel is not possible. To match this painting, I've chosen a very specific French cocktail. This is called a Widow's Kiss, and it's made out of Benedictine, which is a French liquor produced in Normandy, very close to Dieppe, and supposedly based on the recipe provided by Benedictine monks of at least a 16th century recipe for a liquor made out of various herbs from a Benedictine monastery. This is mixed with chartreuse and with calvados, and it is a very strong, delicious drink with a little bit of mint in it, a leaf of mint. And this is called Widow's Kiss because supposedly it was a drink that was given to widows, it's a very strong drink, who had lost their husbands at sea. And one of the things we're going to talk about today in Dieppe is fishermen and life at sea. So I raise a glass to all the fishermen of Dieppe and the citizens of Dieppe. William Turner, as he was known, was born in 1775 in London, at the heart of London in Covent Garden. And his father was a barber, and unlike Constable, who grew up outside of London and whose life was a long period trying to get into the Royal Academy, Turner studied at the Royal Academy as a teenager when he was only 14 and became the youngest ever member of the Royal Academy and spent all of his life showing at the Royal Academy. And here you see a famous painting showing him during so-called varnishing day, putting some final touches on his painting in the great room at the Royal Academy where these paintings were shown. Turner was a very successful painter. His paintings were beloved and criticized at the same time over a period of time at the Academy. And he, unlike Constable, loved to travel. We've heard last week how Constable never left England. Turner instead traveled almost every year from the middle of his life onwards, traveling to the continent, taking sketches, looking at various places all over the continent, in France, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy. Now, we think of travel as something that can happen on a regular basis. And of course, this latest crisis has made us realize that travel may not be as easy as we think of it. I already think of the difference between traveling with a plane to what I would do when I was a kid and traveled by car. Of course, people in the early 19th century traveled in much different ways. They traveled by boat, by horse, by carriage. This is the moment where a lot of the new technology comes in. Steamboats begin, and of course the railways. And the middle of the 19th century is really, the first half and the middle are the periods in which tourism as we know it kind of changes and develops closer to what we think about today. Now, of course, what we need to think about as well is that travel was not something that could happen as easily as we think at that point. Between the late 1790s and 1815, British citizens were not allowed effectively to leave the country. This is the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. England is at war with France, with Napoleon, and of course the borders are closed. We think of the borders that are closed today. Imagine 20 years with closed borders. For 20 years, people in England could not cross the Channel. There was a brief period in 1802 around the Peace of Amiens when people could, and Turner traveled to Europe at that point. But it's really not until after 1815, until Waterloo, that people can. And so Turner from 1817 onwards goes on a yearly pilgrimage to Europe. Every year he travels to Europe, he visits different areas, he portrays different places. And he becomes particularly interested in harbors and harbor scenes. This is one of the great first harbors he paints, Dort, the harbor, the area of Dordrecht in the Netherlands from 1818. And later on in 1826, of course, he paints Cologne in Germany, which is at the Frick. Dort is instead at the Yale Center for British Art. Now, the harbors, the ports of Turner are very much a subject of an exhibition we did at the Frick a few years ago that was curated by Curator Emerita Susan Grace Galassi, and I invite you all to go on our website and look at more about that exhibition, and there are lectures and various tours of the exhibition that you can access online as well. Dieppe sits between Dort and Cologne, so to speak. This was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1825, and it depicts the harbor of Dieppe, of the French town in Normandy, looking south along the Quai Henri IV, which is what you see on the right. Turner had been to Dieppe a couple of times, and he, as he always did with these sort of paintings, he started with sketches in his little sketchbooks, and this is one of the many sketches of Dieppe that survives, showing various areas of the city. But this shows pretty much a similar view from higher above than the one you see in the painting at the Frick. He would also do watercolors, and here's another watercolor with the Quai Henri IV on the right, and at the very end you see the Church of Saint-Jacques, which you finally see in the painting as well. But the painting is this great combination of people and boats along the harbor, showing the bustling life and activity of Dieppe. Now, Dieppe was founded in the 11th century, has medieval foundations, and the name Dieppe supposedly comes from the word deep, because it was a sort of rather deep harbor, and the sea was quite deep there. But it started as a fishing community. And by the time Turner visits Dieppe in the 1820s, it still is a very vibrant fishing community. But the city is also changing with modernity for a number of reasons. So as you look at the painting, you see these 18th century buildings along the Quai Henri IV. Dieppe was heavily bombed in 1694. The Anglo-Dutch bombardment of Dieppe leaves the city in ruins, and it's effectively mostly rebuilt in the 18th century. And that's the city that Turner would have known and that we mostly see today. Now, people are gathering around the banks. There is a lot of activity going on. And as you look at the buildings, you realize there is a tobacconist and a number of different shops. But some of the buildings are still recognizable and are still there today in Dieppe. So this neoclassical building with a tympanum is the Hôtel d'Anvers, which is very much still in the same place. And it's one of the architectural highlights of the city. And in the very background, you see the bell tower and the dome of the medieval church of Saint-Jacques, one of the few surviving monuments that made it after the bombing of 1694. And here is the church today. It's a very beautiful medieval church. And I love the fact that inside it, in the Gothic nave, they actually have a poster of our exhibition from the Frick collection showing the view of Dieppe with the church in the background. When Turner exhibited this at the Royal Academy, he entitled it Dieppe, Changement de Domicile, change of address. And we don't quite know why that is the title, but we think it is to do with this boat. And if you look at this boat, it's full of objects. There are paintings, there are various baskets full of things. And one of the ideas is that this is the move. Somebody is moving house, maybe from one side of the harbor to the other or somewhere else, and they're putting everything on a boat and moving. In fact, when you look at the painting, you realize there are so many details. There is a little flea market, and I wonder if this boat is actually more to do with the flea market than an actual move. There is a fish market. There is a sort of scene of everyday life in the city. There are these beautiful effects of light and shadow. But of course, what you see is mostly boats for fishermen. And in the early 19th century, Dieppe was still a picturesque site where fishermen would be active. And English painters particularly loved Dieppe because of this old-fashioned picturesque style. Now, the life of Dieppe is directly connected to the life of the city directly across the Channel in England, which is Brighton. And in these years, in the 19th century, Brighton was becoming fashionable. The Prince Regent had built his Indian Folly, the Brighton Pavilion there. It became a great place for aristocrats and rich people in England to go on their holidays to the beach. And subsequently, Dieppe being the city that connected by the sea, by the Channel, France and England, Dieppe and Brighton were the connections at that point rather than New Haven. Dieppe, as a consequence, also starts developing. And in the 1820s and 1830s and 40s, it's really when Dieppe becomes a tourist site rather than a fishing village, fishing town. And so you see here the same exact view of Dieppe today, with the Hôtel d'Anvers on the right, with the Church of Saint-Jacques in the background. But of course, now Dieppe is more of a tourist destination than a fishing port. And this idea of a port that changes from something to do with the economics, with food, with fishing, with the livelihood of people in that way, to becoming a resort. It's something that happened to many cities on the sea. And many of the places that we think today as holiday destinations, of course, started very much as harbors for fishing and had a much simpler life. Turner's Dieppe is one of the great masterpieces at the Frick, and people constantly enjoy looking at it. And it was a pleasure to be able, with my colleague Charlotte Vignon, who was the former curator of decorative arts, to actually show the painting to Madame Macron a few months ago, last year. And it is still such a great view of the city. And when people think of Dieppe, they still think very much of that painting. But to me, the view of Dieppe is also about something else. And it's about this beautiful effect of light, of reflection, of atmosphere that Turner does so beautifully and so dramatically. And when you look at Dieppe, you realize that what you're doing is you're looking straight at the sun. You're looking south. This is probably late morning, around midday, and you see the sun as a white disk and this wonderful clear sky with a few clouds. And it is such an extraordinary depiction of the elements. So Dieppe is not only a portrait of a city, it's not only about travel, and we all hope we will be able to travel again very soon, and it won't take us 20 years to be able to get on a plane again and visit France or any other country. But it is about the power of nature and the power of the elements, and that's something that Turner is always interested in. When Turner dies in 1851 in Chelsea, in London, he dies of cholera. another epidemic that is going through London in that year. And supposedly his last words, his dying words were, "The sun is God." I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you're enjoying your widow's kiss. And I would like to raise a glass to my friends in Dieppe who sent me wonderful photos of Dieppe over this period of quarantine to prepare for this, this PowerPoint and this presentation. And look forward to seeing you all next week for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator.